welcome, and thank you all for joining us here on our beautiful Aspen Meadows campus for another of our Hurst Lectures. Let me begin by asking you to join me in thanking Bob and Soledad Hurst for their support of this endowed lecture. And also, please join me, and this is sort of like a season-ending acknowledgement. I'd like to thank Crystal Logan and the Aspen Community Programs, and Jenna Moe and the Society of Fellows. And I'd like to thank all of the staff who make the lighting work and who arrange for the book signings and get the invitations out, run the AV, invite high school students. It's a fantastic team that puts this on. And so we have some other Society of Fellows seminars still, but this is the culmination, no pressure, Carlos, the culmination of what has been a fantastic season. And so it's my pleasure and honor to introduce our panelists. Carlos, and also to remind you that there's a book signing right after the talk, and in fact, there's 2 books out there, so that's pretty cool. Oh. So Carlos, you have to decide which one is your favorite child. I don't know if that's possible, but Carlos is an opinion columnist for the New York Times, and he's co-host of the Matter of Opinion podcast. He wrote the Washington book, How to Read Politics and Politicians, just published. And before that, What Were We Thinking? A Brief Intellectual History of the Trump Era. And I'm not sure how to pronounce the word brief. I'm not sure if you had a tone that you expected when being introduced, so I guess I'll leave that to you. That was in 2020. And formerly a senior editor and book critic and extremely incisive at the Washington Post and managing editor of Foreign Policy, Carlos has also been a journalism fellow at Columbia University and an adjunct professor at the University of Notre Dame. Now, he will be interviewed by the equally accomplished Wendell Willkie. And Wendell is a great friend of the Aspen Institute and an adjunct professor at law at NYU and an adjunct fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He has more than 20 years of experience as general counsel and executive leader at a major multinational company. In government, he served as associate counsel to President Reagan, general counsel and chief of staff at the U.S. Department of Education, and general counsel and deputy secretary at the U.S. Department of Commerce, all under President George Herbert Walker Bush. Wendell was involved with the Council on Foreign Relations, the American Law Institute, has served in numerous advisory and board positions, including the New York Stock Exchange and the SEC. Please join me in welcoming Wendell and Carlos.
Dan, thank you. It's great to be here with Carlos and to be joined by many around the country through webcast. I do want to call out my daughter, Alex, who is watching in Bronxville and who's a great fan of yours, Carlos. She listens to your podcast every week. As Dan said, Carlos is, he's now opinion columnist for the New York Times and for many years was with the Washington Post. And I don't know of anybody who's read or reviewed more books about our public life, public figures, than including many of its most prominent participants, and also commenting on judicial opinions, government reports, and the like than Carlos. So Dan mentioned Carlos's earlier book, in which What Were We Thinking? A Brief Intellectual History of the Trump Era, in which you reviewed like 150 books, right?
Roughly, yes.
Yeah, about Trump and the factors going into the Trump administration. And
that was just a small fraction of the many that were published on that subject.
Well, but you know, our mutual friend Joe Klein, in reviewing your book, said this was an exercise in transcendent masochism.
I'll take the transcendent. Yeah.
But it is, seriously, the book was widely recognized as offering deep insights into how this extraordinary phenomenon, none of us imagined that Donald Trump would actually be elected president. And we were, when we were visiting before, sharing experiences where it was clear that Trump himself didn't really particularly expect to be elected, but it did in fact happen, and it was a reflection of profound developments in our society, our culture, and Carlos's book speaks to that. That being said, I would rather defer conversation about Trump to later in this program, because Carlos, in his more recent book, The Washington Book, has written about so many other things, and we don't need the subject of Trump to suck the oxygen out of the room. So I was at a session at the 92nd Street Y not long ago where your colleague Maggie Haberman was speaking about her latest book about Trump. And this is the 92nd Street Y, which many in the audience would know. But they said as the whole evening would be focused on Trump, they had strategically stationed cardiologists around the room. In any event, Carlos, you've won the Pulitzer Prize for your essays. We're going to talk about a number of them. But as often in this series, it's great for the audience to hear more about your own background in your own words and how you got to where you are today.
Sure. Thank you, Wendell. Thank you to all of you for being here, and to the Aspen Institute for inviting me. I'd not been here before. My wife and I are here, and it is so beautiful out here. It's kind of remarkable. I am from Lima, Peru, originally. I was born in Lima. I came here as a child. My family moved to the Bay Area, so I lived in California in my early years. But we returned to Peru when I was 10 years old. And then I stayed there through middle school and high school, and then made my own decision to come back to the United States. And I came here for college at Notre Dame and graduate school at Princeton. And my aspiration then was to become a policy wonk. I wanted to work in academia and government. I studied economics. I even worked for the Federal Reserve for a while after graduate school. And then I realized that was not the path for me. And I'd had this very romantic vision of journalism, from watching All the President's Men too many times. And I thought, maybe I can do that, right? Having no really clue what it entailed. But weirdly, the thing I wanted to get away from, which was sort of this kind of policy stuff and economics, became my ticket in to journalism. My first job as a journalist was at Foreign Policy magazine, where I edited articles on economics and globalization. Then at the Washington Post, my first job was as the economics editor. So it always helped me, even if it wasn't kind of what I wanted to do. At the Post, I got a chance to do many different things: edit our national security team, our White House team, run the Sunday opinion section, and then I made a transition into book criticism, which was also a very weird move. If you told me when I was younger that in my 40s I would end up being a book critic, I thought, well, I should get an MFA in literature or something. But instead, all the things I'd been working on as a journalist in Washington helped me become a book critic for the Washington Post, where the job was to read memoir and history and policy and politics and biography and sociology and culture. And so it was a thrill. It was an absolute thrill to be able to do that for 7 years at the Post, and I'm taking a very similar approach to my work as a columnist at the New York Times. One sort of weird quirk is that my time as a book critic coincided almost exactly with my time as an American citizen. I became an American citizen in late 2014, so I missed that midterm election. And so my first election as a voter was the totally non-consequential election of 2016. And I feel that I have tried to marry those two realities for me, becoming a book critic and becoming an American citizen almost at exactly the same time. I've used my professional life as a way to further explore and deepen my understanding of my new homeland. So both books that you've referred to in some ways are part of that effort.
So, the great thing, and I hope people will take a look at Carlos's book, The Washington Book, and it's a collection of maybe 50
Yes.
essays about not only public figures whose works he's read, but a broad range of topics, obviously informed by the background that you bring to this. And you write in the book that you had occasion to reflect on the writings of Alexis de Tocqueville and Democracy in America at the time that you became a citizen, and how your perspective as a new citizen informed your reading of that book, which you found in some ways very timely,
Yes.
but also timeless.
A book from 1835 felt very timely in 2015. So I had never read Democracy in America, which I was really embarrassed by. I felt someone who was the book critic at the Washington Post should have read Democracy in America. What I learned is that everyone quotes that book, but not everyone reads it. And so I figured, okay, I've become a citizen, it's time, I have to read this book. And I'm so glad that I did it then. There's so many things to draw from it, which is why it's cited so often, but I'll mention a couple of things that really stayed with me. One thing that struck Tocqueville during his travels through America was the obsession with associational life in the United States. Americans join things, right? Being an American alone is just the first line of an endless drop-down menu of affiliations and identities that you have to choose from here, right? You're expected to join things, to express yourself in some way. They can be, they're not political necessarily, right? It can be, although all these can become political. It can be the PTA, it can be cultural organizations, it can be, athletic organizations. My wife, who's here in the second row, and my daughter are very involved in an Irish dance school in the Washington area, which is a huge part of my wife's cultural heritage. But they often become political, right? You join things in order to try to sway a larger group. You come together in a small community to sway a larger one. Tocqueville wrote, I'm not getting it exactly right, but something to the effect of, in no other nation on earth do people make as much daily use of the unlimited freedom to associate for political ends as in the United States, right? And so that's been a really interesting lens for me through which to interpret so much of what I see day to day in the United States. The other point I want to mention from that book, which I thought was very funny reading it when I was reading it, is that he says that every election season, presidential election season, Americans basically go insane. And
This is not new, in other words.
That's the point. Like, this is not new, right? It feels like a national crisis. It's the only thing anyone can talk about. And then he says something, and this may be a little different. He says, once the election happens, everything goes back to normal, right? And I don't know if that's exactly what's going on here. But his point there is that Americans don't converse, they argue at all times, right? That's actually a quote from the book. And so to me, when I think of that, this book was in the 1830s when he was traveling through the country and seeing this. And it doesn't make the polarization and the division of our time any easier, but it does give me a little bit of comfort to think of it as part of an ongoing, long-term story, a pre-existing condition in American life.
So you recently, just within the last month or so, published an essay on the subject of American exceptionalism. And a lot of people have commented on this essay. I would call it to your attention if it's of interest. And is America an exceptional nation, as I believe Tocqueville would have and others would have said? And if so, what do we mean by that? And it was a really significant reflection on your part about how Ronald Reagan in particular had invoked that concept very effectively to advance his policy agenda, but it has much broader repercussions, and I'm just wondering if you could expand on that.
I've always been fascinated by the shorthand ways we talk about the United States. We have these phrases, right? American exceptionalism is one, but the land of opportunity, right? The nation of immigrants, the American dream, the melting pot, right? And so I'm trying to understand. This is part of the ongoing effort to understand this place. I'm trying to read extensively on each of those and unspool some of those thoughts in some pieces for the Times. They very generously allowed me to do that. So American exceptionalism was the first. And what I found, and what I did is I read as many books as I could find that dealt with this topic, and then looked at how different presidents have talked about this, because it's almost a requirement for presidents to weigh in on American exceptionalism since Ronald Reagan. And I found a couple of things. There's basically two main versions of it. One is really the Reaganite version of American exceptionalism, right? He talked about America as the shining city on a hill, and the idea there is that America is an example to the world. America is a leader for the world. One of the lines that's drawing from the John Winthrop sermon, A Model of Christian Charity, which Reagan added the word shining, which really helped a lot. But in that sermon is the eyes of the world are upon us, right? And the way Reagan interpreted that is that the eyes of the world look to America as an example. There's another version of American exceptionalism, not entirely distinct, but certainly not just in degree but in kind, I think, which I think is associated more with a president like Barack Obama, where he looks at America as a nation which laid out very exceptional principles, which it has struggled in some ways to uphold over time. And the real exceptionalism of America is in that effort to constantly try to live up to these almost impossible principles that were laid out at the very beginning, principles that we were violating from day one, from the moment they were laid out. But that too is a certain kind of exceptionalism. And so these are the kind of two strands that have dominated this debate. What's interesting to me about going back to the Reagan example in particular is that he was drawing from the John Winthrop sermon. As I said, John Winthrop was the Puritan governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Wrote this in 1630. There's some debate over when exactly he said it, but even in that sermon, Winthrop was not engaging in a celebratory exercise of what this new experiment was going to be. That sermon was a warning. Yeah. It was a caution. It was like, the eyes of the world are upon us because they're waiting for us to screw up, And if we get, over our skis on beating our chest about who we are, we're not being true to this foundation. So Reagan knew this because in earlier iterations he would talk about this sermon much more in the cautionary sense, like during the 60s and 70s. But once he took office, it became part of the kind of Morning in America mystique that he used to great effect during his presidency. So I think this tension between these two versions of exceptionalism, still both pretty congratulatory to some extent, drive a lot of our politics. And it seems that every candidate, every president is at some point asked, is America exceptional, and what do you mean by that?
Well, you could say, I suppose, that our founders, when they came together in Philadelphia in 1787 to draft the Constitution in secret because the Articles of Confederation had been such an unmitigated disaster, that they saw themselves as exceptional in imagining a self-governing constitutional republic when all the rest of the world pretty much were, led by monarchies. And there was serious question as to whether this might succeed, right? That's why it was an American experiment. So it does seem to me, at the end of the Reagan administration, the public mood was much better than it had been when he was elected, because the 70s, let's face it, were not a great decade. You had the end of Vietnam, when America was humiliated, Nixon resigns in disgrace. You had economic stagflation. You had the Soviets in Afghanistan. You had Iran. And so for whatever reasons, and you can argue about the particulars, the 80s and the 90s under Bill Clinton were, more of a euphoric period about. But I sort of wonder whether exceptionalism, there's some who would say that that means that we are the most powerful, or does it mean that we are exceptional in terms of that we're defined by ideals as opposed to, shall we say, blood and soil?
I wouldn't think of, personally, I wouldn't think of exceptionalism as a straight up kind of measure of power, right? Say that China passes the United States on certain economic indicators as it has. Does that mean that we are no longer exceptional and China is, right? I don't think that's the case. I think that you have to return to ideas and ideals, both embedded in the Constitution, which is going to be the next of these essays about the Constitution, but also just in the Declaration. Jill Lepore wrote a wonderful book, the historian at Harvard and New Yorker writer, wonderful book called These Truths, where she talks about the self-evident truths of the Declaration as the basis for evaluating all of American history, right? And those were also truths we didn't live up to even at the beginning, but it's all part of that struggle to get there. So I think Trump has been asked about exceptionalism. I know we're steering away from this, but I think he sees it in sort of cruder terms of power, like, are we number one, in this category or that category, and that's a different interpretation of exceptionalism. It's easier to understand, right, than talk of high principles and the rest, but it's a difference, I think, even from the two strands that I laid out earlier.
Yeah. So Reagan obviously is sort of a figure who's assumed greater stature in history, but we still have with us a former president who's had an extraordinary run, albeit as a one-term president, but who leaves behind a great legacy, who turns 100 this fall. And I gather the Times has asked you to think really thoughtfully and incisively about Jimmy Carter's legacy. And I know you have yet to publish on his, but I think, just to sort of bookend with Reagan in the 80s and the 70s, if you could just comment on your thoughts about Carter's legacy.
So one thing I try to do is, when a public figure of this stature is sort of approaching the end, I read through that person's body of work, writings, speeches, and the rest. Try to understand these leaders through their own words. I did that with George H.W. Bush when he passed away, and I'm engaging in that exercise with Jimmy Carter. I feel sort of personal about it because Carter was president when I came here as a kid, and so my earliest political memories are about Jimmy Carter, are about the ticker on the evening local news and in the Bay Area that showed how many days the hostages had been in Iran. Those memories are sort of very strong in my mind. But I recently read, Carter published many books, the benefit of having such a long post-presidency. And among the dozens of books he published were what I would consider 4 real memoirs. And so I've been going through those and reading those. One that I was surprised by, he has a White House memoir, a White House diary, a really nice book about his first campaign ever in Georgia. But he wrote a book called An Hour Before Daylight, which I hope some of you have read. If not, I would really encourage you to read it after reading this one. It's a book about growing up on his father's farm in Georgia during the Depression. And it's just a lovely account of a boyhood that has kind of vanished. And there's one anecdote that really stayed with me that I think connects to something I read about Carter in one of his later memoirs. When he was a kid, his playmates were largely, until they got to school, his playmates were largely the children of the black workers that worked on his dad's farm. And so he spent a ton of time with them in their homes, and he met their families. And he noticed that their parents would often really share with him a lot of their struggles, their difficulties, their worries. And it took him a while to realize that they were hoping he would share this in turn with his parents, right? They couldn't really communicate. They just inhabited different worlds in many ways, even though they worked the same land. And so this young Jimmy realizes that they had to come to trust him, right? Which to him was very special. So I kind of file that away in my head. Later I'm reading Carter's White House memoir, and he's at Camp David, and he's negotiating between, Begin and Sadat, right? The Israeli and Egyptian delegations, trying to come up with what became the Camp David Accords, and there once again he's a go-between between two sides that do not understand each other, and the trust that they had in him was the most important thing that he brought to the table. At one point, he gets really mad at Begin. One of the few moments when Carter raises his voice during these negotiations says, I can't do anything here unless you trust me, and I feel that you don't trust me. And so I immediately thought of the episode in his childhood and the episode at Camp David, and that became the lens through which I began to think about Carter's legacy, that so much of his presidency, so much of why he became president, following the Nixon era with the Ford interregnum, is that he was trying to be someone that the American people could trust. He was trying to be someone that the families who worked with his father could trust. He was trying to be someone that Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin could trust. And his life was just one big effort at being that person, in the trust exercise who would be there to catch you. And so that's kind of sometimes when you read all these books, there's just one thing that stays with you and becomes the lens through which you see it all. And for me, that's the lens through which I think of Jimmy Carter.
So Reagan was followed by the first President Bush. Interesting to me, I had the privilege of working in his administration, but one of the first essays in your book, where as I said, you've read more books by public figures than anyone else, and your essay is on the autobiography that you wish George Bush had written but did not. Could you just concisely share what your thoughts were there?
Sure. I like the concisely because I'm going too long in some of these answers.
Not at all. I'm looking at the clock, and I know we want to afford opportunity for questions.
Bush never wrote a memoir. He studiously avoided writing a real memoir. He wrote some books, right? He had a ghost-written memoir in '87, I believe, when he was sort of about campaigning for the presidency, and he even said it's the kind of book that you're supposed to publish when you're running for president. He published his diary from his time in China when he was the U.S. envoy to China in the '70s, which he didn't even want to do. Some academic did all the work for him in putting it together. He published a collection of his letters, which is a wonderful collection called All the Best, George Bush. And then he published he co-wrote a book on foreign policy with Brent Scowcroft, where they alternated chapters, and Scowcroft's chapters were better. And so he never really wrote a full-on memoir. And yet, as I read these books, I found so many things that could have made for a terrific, really self-aware kind of memoir if he'd just gone to the trouble. But he didn't want to. So I tried to write it for him, right? And I found a few things that really struck me about George H.W. Bush that I think run counter to the way I had thought about him, certainly, and the way I think kind of a general public might think about him. First of all, he's like Mr. Kennebunkport, and he comes from wealth and privilege, but he was kind of pondering his own privilege way before it was popular to do that, right? It was something he was uncomfortable with. He knew he had the reputation of caring more about foreign policy than about domestic issues, and it pissed him off, but he admits that it's true, and that he was better in the first realm than the second. His own experience of being shot down in war, of being the youngest aviator in the Navy at the time, made him very cautious about engaging in warfare. Yet when he was engaged in the first Gulf War, he exhibited in his diaries certainly this very kind of emotional, militant worldview about Saddam Hussein that then I think we tend to associate more with his son in the second Gulf War than with him. The one thing he got critiqued about a lot was lacking the vision thing. Remember that? He just didn't have the vision. He couldn't. He struggled at putting America on a bumper sticker. It kind of pissed him off that he had to do that when he was running for president. But what becomes clear to me from reading his books is that he did have a vision, except it was much more a vision about means than ends. He wanted whatever was going on in the world, he wanted the United States to be at the head of the table, to be in a position of leadership. When the first Gulf War ended in victory, yes, he was pleased that he'd kicked Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, but he was more pleased about the fact that American leadership had been restored, that we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome finally. And of course, he had a very clear idea of who should be the person leading the United States when the United States was at the head of the table. He had sort of noblesse oblige sense of public service. And so I write in that essay that's in this book that he did have a vision. He just needed to look in the mirror to find it, right? American leadership and his leadership was its own end. And so that's what I walked away with from reading George H.W. Bush's non-memoir memoirs.
But another president who obviously was extraordinarily gifted with the pen and not afraid of using it was Barack Obama. And I read Memories of My Father.
Yeah.
Yeah, which was, he published long before, right? I mean, he
In
was
the
thinking
90s.
about running for president for a long time, but this was well before he had a public career, I believe.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
And, I mean, it's really an extraordinary work, and it's a book, you comment on that and his other writings, but what lessons might you take away from that about his presidency?
Yeah. So one thing I've concluded about reading books by presidents is that the closer the book comes out to their time in office, the worse it is, by far. They're too defensive, they're too in the weeds, they're too knee-jerk when they're reflecting on their immediate experience in the White House. Of the various Carter memoirs I've read, the worst is certainly the book he published right after being in the White House. And so that holds true, I think, with Barack Obama. He's a very gifted writer. I think both he and Carter are two presidents who just could have been writers, right? Who could have just made their living as writers. Not many of them fit that category. But I think whatever Barack Obama writes, he's written volume 1 of his presidential memoirs. He wrote The Audacity of Hope that came out before his 2008 campaign. I think all his books will always suffer in comparison to Dreams from My Father. And the reason for that, I think, is Obama, in many ways, all presidents use biography, to their own biographies, to kind of justify and propel their candidacies and their visions. But with Obama, it was this all-purpose, governing tool, this default reference for everything. Like, he would improve relations with the Muslim world. Why? Because he came from a Muslim father, he'd spent time in the Muslim world, he could do it, right? He would improve race relations in America. Why? Because of his own unique background. His aides really perpetuated that view, that he was the personification of the change he would bring to the country. And the book in which you see that sense of self coming together is in Dreams from My Father. Right? There were moments when he really identified more as like an international student. All his friends were like the Pakistani international students in New York. It wasn't really until Chicago, right? There is no Obama presidency without Chicago, right? And in Chicago, where he joins Trinity Church, where he's a community organizer in a prominently African-American community, that he sort of fully embraces and understands. Chicago's also where he met Michelle, where he fully embraces and understands the identity that would become his and that would propel him to the White House. So I think that it's also just beautifully written. Biographers have very correctly, pored over it and found that, he played fast and loose with some things. He compressed some characters. He eliminated this one girlfriend that was really pivotal in his life, that David Aguero found years later, a biographer. All that is true. But it is as an example of a young man with a clear sense of purpose and mission, but not clear on how to live that out, grappling with his own identity. I find that book sort of seminal in understanding him, no matter how many more volumes he writes of his White House memoirs.
But as you say, the title is Dreams of My Father. His father, who was an extraordinarily gifted man whom he never met, right? And
He met him once.
Met him once?
Met him once when he was maybe between 8 or 12 years old. He brought him a basketball. Yeah. And, I mean, lots of presidents have daddy issues, right? And that's what propels them to run in many cases. Now, I mean, this is, and
his mother was a pivotal figure for him.
But it was really it was really his mother, an anthropologist, who took him around the world, who woke him up early in the morning to go over these great texts of of America. The Declaration, Gettysburg, and the rest, was the person who raised him, along with the Kansas side of his family, his grandparents. But it was that absence of his father that was what drove so much of his quest for identity. And I mean, you see this with George W. Bush and George H.W. I mean, Al Gore ran in '88 the first time because he wanted his father to see him run for president. There were all these, you see this all the time. Bill Clinton also suffered from the absence of a father. Right. And so it's in Obama's case, though, it's just rendered in what is really a work of literature as much as any kind of political analysis.
It's a beautiful read,
yeah,
for sure. Although I gather that particularly his time spent in Kenya, there were episodes that were more imagined, and he never really presented it as fully autobiographically correct in every particular, right?
Yeah,
it is Dreams of My Father.
It's interesting. There are some biographers who know more about Obama's Kenyan family than Obama does, right? Because they went there, they interviewed everyone. Obama didn't have a lot of time there, and so it's not just absence for a father figure. It's sort of trying to figure out a part of your identity that you've just because of the passage of time you've never been able to really carve out. My wife and I took our kids to Peru right before the pandemic. We didn't know it was right before the pandemic. I mean, it just happened that way. And for them to be able to see this, the neighborhoods I came from, where I grew up, meet the extended family, that matters so much. He only got to do that much later in life, when kind of who he was already formed.
So I want just a few minutes left. Fast forward to, and we'll take questions in just 5-6 minutes here, but to the current race and one particular area of focus, Carlos, because your particular strength is in examining the written word and teasing out what its real meaning is. And we have two candidates today, and obviously the differences are stark, but there's serious questions about where they really are on a range of policy issues. So, with Kamala Harris, there's a question, how far is she going to pivot from positions taken in 2019, 2020 towards more of the political center, which would seem to be more viable. In Trump's case, his policy agenda is presumed to be substantially informed by work at the Heritage Foundation, where many folks in his prior administration now serve, but with the exception of they agree that we shouldn't tax tips on, service providers, there's a lot of
You suddenly agree, right?
Yeah, suddenly agree.
Yeah.
There's a lot of unstated policy. Maybe we'll hear more in the Democratic convention next week. We probably will. You know, Donald Trump has been quite harsh in running away from provisions in the Heritage 2025 report. You've read all 887 pages of it. You've read Kamala Harris's book. I mean, what might we infer about where each candidate is on policy issues based on what you've seen and read?
Sure. First, I think there's so much we don't know about them. Kamala Harris, because in part she's been reticent to be very clear on that. Trump, in part, because he changes so easily, and it's very difficult to kind of pin him down. So I'll just speak briefly on each. So it's funny you ask about Harris, because tomorrow morning I'm supposed to file a piece to my editor about Harris's two books. Her 2019 memoir, The Truths We Hold, and her 2009 book, lesser known, called Smart on Crime, about her experience as a prosecutor. So I was working on that on the flight to Aspen. I've been working on it sitting in the Molly Hotel. So when you see it next week, know that it was really inspired right here. And what's interesting to me about Harris is that when she wrote the first book in 2009, she was, I think, in her second term as DA in San Francisco. She would go on to be Attorney General of California. And at the time, being a sort of, a tough prosecutor was considered a bonus for Democrats running for higher office. And so in that book, even as she tries to, I'm not tough on crime or soft on crime, I'm smart on crime, that was the title of the book, that was the positioning, she takes a series of positions that 10 years later, when she's running for president, in sort of in the Black Lives Matter era, are, to use a popular term, much more problematic for a Democrat. This was pre-George Floyd, but it was certainly post-Ferguson, post-Trayvon, post so much else. And so suddenly being a prosecutor was no longer attractive. And that's part of the reason her campaign sort of flamed out so quickly the last time around. She was, in the second book, she tries to kind of soften the edges of the first book. But one thing that I found fascinating in the second book is, actually in both, she talks often of false choices. She doesn't like being pinned down by false choices. Like, I don't have to be, either for the police or for police accountability. I'm for both. It's a false choice. I don't have to be for, the rights of citizens versus the rights of the undocumented. I'm for both. It's a false choice, right? And it sounds very sage to say something is a false choice, and often it is. Often I'm sure she's right. But politics is all about making difficult decisions between competing priorities. And I think her unwillingness sometimes to recognize that those choices exist is part of why I think she's had a hard time carving out a distinctive role as VP, and why I think she may have been reticent so far to really lay out detailed policy positions. What I'll say about Project 2025, I did read all 887 pages of it. It's a very dense document. It walks through the executive branch, department by department, agency by agency, office by office. Let's get rid of that, let's kill that, let's grow that. It's very, very detailed. Trump has sort of disowned it, in part because it violates the number one rule of Trump strategizing, which is like, don't write anything down. It's very kind of like mafia boss in that way, right? And the big sin they created was that they wrote it down, right? And so you could preemptively attack the non-existent Trump administration for things they hadn't even done yet by all these plans that they had laid out. There's three things that I think are most important in them. I'll try to get through them quickly. First, flood the zone with loyalists, right? Loyalty is the overwhelming value, more than expertise or experience or competence. And so there's a whole sort of plan to try to push out career civil servants, bring in loyalists to the Trump cause. Second, politicize the DOJ, Department of Justice in particular, right? Trump complains it's been weaponized against him. Actually, he says that he very much wants to try to do the same thing. He wants litigation decisions to be based on his own preferences. He wants the FBI director to be as aligned with the Trump agenda as the head of any other agency, right? He wants to sort of treat the Justice Department as his own personal lawyer, even more so than, say, like a White House counsel, right, as something you know about. And the third point I'll make about this is that we hear a lot about how the Steve Bannons of the world and other people in the Trump orbit want to dismantle the administrative state, right? This out-of-control federal bureaucracy that has become too powerful and needs to be cut down to size. Based on this book, I don't think that's true. I think that they don't want to dismantle the administrative state. They want to enlist it. They want to use it. They want to redirect it for their own agenda and their own purposes. At the end of the book, it says, we want to tear this down, but it's very hard to do. So in the meantime, we obviously have to try to, enlist it to further our own agenda. In the meantime, in Washington, ends up meaning forever, right? Things don't get, once you have that power in your hands, it's very hard to let it go. And it's not just Republicans, it's sort of Democrats as well. But so those are the three takeaways that I have from Project 2025. And as much as they were trying to distance themselves from it, the Trump campaign, all the people who wrote it are going to be working in the Trump administration anyway, or will be looking for jobs in the administration. So I think it's a useful tip sheet for some of the things they might be doing.
Depending on what his attention span may happen to be on any given issue.
Yes, but precisely because it's so limited in some cases, I think people will just have a lot of free rein. Yeah. There's a few things he cares about. Trump has cared about immigration and about trade and about racial issues his whole life. Those are the kind of the things that have been animating him. Right. And anything else, kind of whatever plays well is fine with him.
Well, he thinks, going back to exceptionalism, he probably thinks that the traditional agenda associated with sort of post-war America's liberal democratic role, that while we provided unique leadership in a range of fora too numerous to name, that in fact the United States was being taken advantage of.
It just changed the countries, right? When he was talking in the 80s, it was Japan. Now it's China, right? But it's always the same kind of worldview, very zero-sum. And I'm not here to sort of denigrate all of that. It certainly struck a nerve. I think the benefits of globalization were vastly oversold, and I think we came to realize that later. And Trump has politically capitalized on that.
So let's. We have a few minutes left. I see a hand in the back. We have mics. Please keep questions. There are a number of hands in the air. We'll go back here. Please keep your question brief and to the point, and we'll make the most of the time remaining.
Was it for me or over here?
You have the mic.
Thank you. In all due respect, I'm curious if you've written an essay or if you will write an essay on how many wonderful people in academia and public service missed the basics of Trump. You talked about mob boss mafia mentality. His godfather was Roy Cohn, the McCarthy lawyer. His other godfather was from the Lucchese family. So I'm wondering if you've looked at the psychodynamics of how some people understood in 2015 what was coming with fascism and how the filters of our thinking blocked that out in terms of his psychodynamics and his history.
Thank you. I have reviewed 2 books that deal with that issue that I would bring to your attention. One is, and I'm blanking on the name because it was among the 150 in that first book. It's called The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, by basically a collection of essays, in many cases by psychiatrists and psychologists who were kind of evaluating him from afar, which is a violation of what used to be called the Goldwater rule, right? That you don't try to diagnose psychology without actual communication with the patient. But that was a book that attempted to do that. One that got into the history that you're talking about more is one I think you brought up, Maggie Haberman's book, Confidence Man. Haberman had the benefit of having covered Trump in the sort of New York tabloid world long before he entered politics. And she is able to bring to life that history in a way that I think illuminates a lot of the presidency that she also covered. Confidence Man, of course, speaks to both the issues that you raise in terms of his of some of the mob boss instincts, but also some of the psychology kind of issues about just the unbridled confidence that comes with a stunning lack of self-awareness.
Yes, right here.
Oh,
I'll repeat your question. Paula.
Is democracy on the ballot?
Is democracy on the ballot? Thank you, Paula.
It always is, right? Timothy Snyder, a historian, wrote a wonderful book, a short little book called On Tyranny. And he said, I hope this is okay, it's a little R-rated. He said, the last time you have sex, you don't know it's the last time you're having sex. Voting is like that, right? And that always stayed with me. I'm sorry, is that okay? You can bleep me out. But I think that every election is pitched as the most important election, right? 2016 was the most important election. 2020 was the most important. Now 2024 is definitely the most important, right? Simply, being able to perpetuate the exercise of voting, of free and fair elections in which a majority of the people have the ability to offer their say, that exercise, in turn, we keep it going by continuing to engage in it, right? Sort of self-fulfilling in that sense. I often play this little mind game with friends of mine who are, say, more on the left, and I say, like, okay, go back to 2012. Maybe that election was really the one where democracy was on the ballot, because say Romney had won. Obama is a one-term president. Romney wins, runs for re-election in 2016. There's no Trump presidency, right? Would you be willing to trade away the second Obama term if you knew it would keep Trump from reaching office, right? And like that freaks people out to think about it, right? Because it's like, no, I don't want to do that, but maybe I should, So in other words, democracy, I think, is sort of constantly on the ballot. But even if Kamala Harris wins this election, right, which may be the tenor of your question, right, that if Trump wins it, that democracy is more at risk. Even in loss, we've seen that Trump isn't necessarily willing to accept that result. So, in a sense, it's not just what happens that day. It's not just how we mark up those ballots, right? It's the whole kind of infrastructure of democracy, of elections, that matters here, much more so than just what happens every 4 years. I always worry about thinking of American democracy as this exercise of voting every 4 years or every 2 years in midterms. It's an ongoing, daily quest to sort of keep it going. It gets to American exceptionalism, like sort of always fighting to uphold those principles, not just on election day.
I think Reagan said freedom is, there's always the potential of freedom being one generation from extinction. So back here.
Did we get Tom Hirsch?
Yes. Oh, where's Tom Hirsch? I know.
Yeah.
So intriguingly, you mentioned that gifted writer who was also President Obama, that he deleted a mention of a very important relationship he had with a woman as part of his story, a defining experience, right? So I'm curious, and you also mentioned about the difficulty that politicians have of making choices. You have a difficulty, and as an opinion columnist, in making choices of what they say in the context in which they say it, and also what they don't say. And I'm curious to understand, and actually quite intrigued, how do you make decisions? Because politicians present what they want to present to different audiences at different times. and there's a different equivalence of meaning, there's a different context within which the meaning that they wish to present is accentuated in one audience and one day versus another in terms of what they say. But also there's what they choose not to say. So how do you sort out, as an opinion columnist, what to write about and translate from the complexity of everything we just been discussing, which is a morass?
Yes, it is a morass.
And making sense of it and making prioritization sense of it.
I like the distinction you make between what politicians say and what they choose to omit, because we often focus on the thing that they say, right? It's like, oh my God, did you see what so and so said, or or did you read this speech or hear that speech? I'm just as interested by the omissions, and I'll give you one example of an omission that just really stays with me. Mike Pence wrote a memoir called "So Help Me God." And it's a real memoir. It kind of goes through his whole life, but it obviously lingers on the events of January 6th. And he takes a bit of a victory lap for standing up for democracy on that day. I think that's okay. I mean, I think maybe you get partial credit if for saving democracy from the brink if you kind of carried it there in the first place. But still, he did what he did, right? And I think that we're the better for his actions on that day. So he goes on about that day in his book, and there's one moment where he quotes from Donald Trump's video message to the rioters at the Capitol, where sort of later in the afternoon he finally says, like, you have to leave. And here's how he. Can I grab this for a second? Here's how he quotes him. He says something like he quotes Trump. I have to sort of find the table of contents in my own book. The Mike Pence, page 97. There we go. He quotes Trump saying, "I know you're hurting. I know you're in pain. ... But you have to go home now. We have to have peace." Right? And Trump did say that. Right? He said those words. But when I saw that quote, I'm immediately drawn to the ellipses. Right? I'm like, what did Pence omit? Right? And it's a long book. He could have done the full quote, right? What did he omit? So I look up the video, probably on C-SPAN. I spend way too much of my life on C-SPAN. Here's what he said. So I asked, what did Pence erase with that ellipsis? And here's what Trump said in the middle of that passage. "We had an election that was stolen from us. It was a landslide election. Everyone knows it, especially the other side." And only then does he go on to say, "But you have to go home now. We have to have peace," right? So what's remarkable about that is that even in his memoir, right, which is, you would think, his statement for history, right, Mike Pence, he still skips the moment in Trump's quote where Trump is reiterating the lie about the stolen election. So even in this statement for history, Pence is still covering for his boss. He's still, and on a day when Trump did not lift a finger to help him or to protect him, when people were calling for Pence to get hurt, he was still covering for Trump. And so when I said that sometimes there's just one thing in a book that will stay with me, that is the one thing that stays with me from this lengthy book called "So Help Me God." To me, so much of Pence's vice presidency is captured in those three little dots in that book.
We have time for, okay, over here.
Wait.
Oh. Sorry, I think we had.
I've been cut off 3 times now.
Oh, sorry, you have someone here who's been.
Okay, hold.
You know what? Can you each ask your question?
We have time for 2
and then,
questions.
ask them both, and then I'll address them both.
Sure.
Yeah. So just quick. Go for it, sir.
I almost fainted. one of the reasons that Aspen Institute is such a treasure and such a blessing is because we have speakers like you who have read every word of these things and analyzed as much as you have and read as much as you have. My concern going forward is that there won't be institutions like the New York Times to pay you a salary to do that at a time when artificial intelligence, even before artificial intelligence, we're dealing now with so much information being spread based on lies and agendas and political stuff that the vast majority of people don't get information from people like yourself. It's a blessing for us. But do you have any concerns about the state of the world and the state of the United States going forward, given the fact that what I'm saying clearly seems to be the trend?
All right, sir.
In light of what we saw on January 6th, your comment about we'll do this every 2 or 4 years brings to my mind a question related to if Kamala Harris wins the election, what is your expectation based on your reading of what will likely occur? Will there be another January 6th? Will there be a termination of democracy? Will the Heritage Foundation and 2025 be able to implement an entirely new form of government?
All right, this is simple. So, future of information and technology and future democracy. A minute and 20 seconds. We're good. We're good. The answer to your question, sir, is I live in constant fear of exactly what you have laid out, and not solely for the high-minded reasons that you have laid out, but for sort of self-preservation, for the funding of my kids' college savings funds. Recently, a dear friend of mine, who was a former book critic at the New York Times, sent me an AI-generated version of a review of a book that she and I had both reviewed, I for the Post and she for the Times. This was a wonderful book, Matthew Desmond's book, Evicted, which some of you may have read. And it was really good. I like to think that mine was better, but mine won't get better, whereas the AI will get better, right? So in a very self-serving sense, I have a concern about that. I have a concern about it also in an institutional sense, that the nightmare of news organizations is Siri, what's the news? Right? And then Siri proceeds to tell you the news without any attribution, tailored to your own kind of pre-existing biases, and with no compensation for those organizations that generated the original reporting that the AI is drawing upon. I do not have a solution for that. That's not even getting into the misinformation questions. This is actually kind of very straightforward versions of it that trouble me. There are greater minds than my own digging into that. I hope not just within news organizations, but within all manner of organizations. They're trying to figure out how to harness this incredibly powerful tool and not be devastated by it. I have no idea what's going to happen You see a recurring theme here in these two answers. Somehow, I don't imagine it'll be the same as January 6th. I imagine we'll prepare for that eventuality, and then it'll be a different one, right? It may be that, many county-level election officials throughout the country, are already sort of in the tank one way or the other, right? And the battle that we will see will play out on entirely different sorts of platforms. I would commend the work of the Brennan Center at NYU that has looked into scenarios surrounding the coming election. Bart Gellman is an old colleague of mine from the Washington Post. He later went to the Atlantic and now is at Brennan, and they're doing very good work in this regard. It's the old thing about you're always fighting the last war. I don't think, I can't imagine it'll play out just like we saw last time around. It'll be different. Kamala Harris, weirdly, has experience personally when she was running in California with contested election night results. So I hope that that is a useful experience that she would bring to bear on some eventuality. But I would say it seems like we're right there, but there is a lot to happen even before we get to an election. I'm much more focused on what might happen on election night, election day, election week as it is now. And I think that's probably plenty to be focused on at the moment. I'll leave it to better minds to try to imagine the scenarios that'll follow.
So we've just scratched the surface of thoughts that Carlos brings to the table, and I'd ask you to join me in a round of applause. Thank you, and come back.
Thank you, Wendell. Really appreciate it. Thank you.